Romans chapter 3, starting at verse 9, reading through to verse 31. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We've already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and a way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of sin. But now a righteousness from God apart from the law has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. The righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? It's excluded. On what principle? On that of observing the law? No, but on that of faith. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith, do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. Just before the COVID lockdown, we had a short series looking at some inspirational characters in Christian history. And those of you who are here, I'm sure you remember exactly all the different characters that we covered, but some of you weren't here, so I'll recap for you. We looked at Augustine of Hippo, who I just think is the best named person in the history of the church. That's fantastic. Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, Richard Wurmbrand. And then lockdown came back again, the second lockdown, and we had to do our services by Facebook. And I remember doing a Facebook service about local girl Edith Cavell. And of all the different series I've done, that's the series that most of you have come and said, we really enjoyed that. That was brilliant. So, when are we going to have more like that again? Well, 2 weeks ago at our open service New Year's Day, I noted that it was 250 years since the great hymn Amazing Grace was first sung in public. And I thought, it's a good time perhaps to go back and revisit some of those heroes of the Christian faith. And we'll look at John Newton today, the writer of Amazing Grace. Best known for writing that hymn and two other really well-known hymns, one of which we've just sung, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds. A Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken was written by John Newton as well, but he was a renowned teacher and preacher and a writer of Christian books. And in one publication, he summed up what it means to have Christian faith. He said, "This is faith, a renouncing of everything we are apt to call our own, and relying wholly on the blood, righteousness, and intercession of Jesus." When we talk about being a Christian, when we talk about faith, this is what we mean. It's a great description. So how did John Newton get to be this great teacher and renowned songwriter? He was born in London in 1725. His mum was a devout Reformed Christian, and she would read to John from the Bible. She taught him about the great reformers of years gone by, some of those very people that we looked at in that series. But she prayed with him every night. As she took young John to bed, she prayed. And there was particular themes to her prayers that John remembered. And the main one being that the wonder of God's grace offered even to the very worst of sinners. She would also pray that one day John would be a great preacher. Sadly, John's mum died when he was just 7. His dad remarried, and John felt ignored, even cruelly treated by his dad and his stepmom. But he kept in touch with his mum's family and would go to visit them whenever he could. His dad had retired from a shipping company, and when John finished his education, his dad arranged for him to sail to Jamaica to work in the company's office there. Now that's a father's love, isn't it? Welcome to manhood, go to Jamaica, where we'll have no contact with you whatsoever. There's worse places in the world to go, perhaps. His dad arranged for him to sail. Everything was booked. Before he was due to go, John went to visit some of his mum's family in Kent. There he saw and instantly fell in love with Mary Catlett. He was so besotted with Mary that he overstayed, missed his boat to Jamaica, and ended up in a furious row with his dad. His dad punished him by forcing him to join the Navy as the lowest ranked seaman. With his background and his upbringing, he would have expected to have joined as an officer, but his dad said, "No, you are going to join as the lowest ranked seaman in the Navy." He hated it, and he missed Mary. It's quite a love story going on here. He hated the Navy so much, and he loved Mary so much, that he decided to jump ship and run away. He wasn't very good at running away. He got caught. He got dragged back to the ship and severely punished. He was stripped to the waist, shackled, and given 8 dozen lashes. 8 dozen. Who's good at maths? 96. I was able to get ahead of you and have it written down before you could think. 96 lashes. It took him a long time to recover, both physically and mentally. He laid on his bed recovering, contemplating how he could murder the captain or commit suicide by jumping overboard, or both. Eventually he recovered physically, but struggled psychologically for a long time after that beating. And he started to lead a really hedonistic lifestyle. Writing about it later, he said, I sinned with a high hand and made it my study to tempt and seduce others. John had been brought up, certainly up to the age of 7, being taught right from wrong. His mum had taught him from the Bible. She'd prayed for him. And yet he seemed to be living proof of some of the words that we read from Romans chapter 3. Verse 10, there is no one righteous, no, not one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. No, not even one who had been taught so well and prayed for so well by his mum. Verse 23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. He sinned and he called others to join in his sin with him. And as I read about this, as I was sort of planning for this week, I wondered what his mum would have thought if she'd still been alive then. What questions would have been racing through her mind? What did I do wrong? Why doesn't God answer my prayers for his soul? Why has John rebelled against me and against God? One of the things that most of us perhaps know about John Newton's pre-conversion life is that he served aboard slave trading ships. He treated humans from another country and another race as if they were just commodities to be used. We hear all those horror stories of how slaves were thrown from the ships to reduce the weight in bad weather. They kept in conditions below decks that, quite honestly, today we're not allowed to keep cattle in conditions like those. God made every human being in his own image, and John's sin against people and against God was huge. Here surely was a man who did not deserve God's grace. Verse 18, there was no fear of God before his eyes. On the night of the 21st of March, 1748, he was on board a ship. He was woken up by the ship being thrown around really violently in awful weather, woken as well by the shouts of the crew. One person had already been swept overboard by the waves. It looked as though the ship was going to be destroyed. John joined the rest of the crew, bailing out the ship and pumping as fast as they could. But it seemed futile. As quickly as they could offload the water, more was coming over the top with every wave that hit them. He was certain that they were all about to drown when he remembered his mum's prayers from his early childhood. He remembered particularly those prayers that spoke of God's grace even to the very worst of sinners. And he spoke his first faltering prayers in many years. Miraculously, he and the rest of the crew were spared. And John referred to the 21st of March 1748 as his conversion date, the hour he first believed. He wasn't instantly transformed into what we might think of as a model Christian. In his biography, he wrote of a serious time of backsliding and struggling with personal sin. It was only some years later, after he suffered a serious illness, that he made the life-transforming decision to truly live out the righteousness of God that is given to all whose faith is in Jesus. In 1750, he finally got to marry Mary Catlett, who had been waiting patiently for him during his years of wandering. What might surprise us most when we think about John Newton's life is that at this stage he remained part of the slave trade. He didn't instantly reject that as the horrible thing that he later came to see it. It was only gradually, over several years, that God changed his heart towards the people who he'd been exploiting. But when he did turn against the slave trade, he did so with a real conviction of God's calling. He worked with William Wilberforce to campaign for the abolition of the trade. In 1787, he published a pamphlet, Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade, which instantly sold out and had to be reprinted a number of times. A pamphlet which contributed hugely to the public awareness of the barbarity of that trade. He worked in Liverpool, but he would often travel down to London to hear the great preachers of that time, John Wesley, George Whitefield, before training and being ordained as an Anglican minister and taking on a parish in Olney, which is near modern-day Milton Keynes. He'd always loved music. And as a minister, he would compose one-off hymns to support his sermon, to sort of make the point of the sermon in music form. Many of these songs were autobiographical, reflecting on his life, what it had been, his rebellious past, and his sense of wonder at God saving even a sinner such as himself. Such was the thought behind his most famous hymn that we've already sung this morning. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, now I'm found. Was blind, now I see. Later life, he almost completely lost his eyesight. He understood those words even more powerfully, what it means to really see, to know God. It was grace that taught my heart to fear. Grace, my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. That hour on the boat when he first believed and remembered God's grace towards even the worst of sinners. And as I thought about the life and the salvation of this man, it occurred to me, here is a real life demonstration of what Paul wrote about in Romans chapter 3. In verse 23, he was a man who was truly falling short of God's glory. He was treating people made in the very image of God as beasts to be exploited for money. Verse 24, he had earned nothing from God. He'd done nothing to earn salvation, to earn God's grace, to earn God's love. No, he had been justified freely by God's grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. Verse 27 reminds us that because we're saved by God's grace, saved by the sacrifice of Jesus, there can be no boasting. We're not saved by our own efforts. We're not saved by our own goodness. Our salvation is 100% a gift of God. And I see life lessons here for us as well. Not just in the life of John Newton, but in the faith of his mum. John rebelled. John was a sinner who rejoiced in rebelling and rejoiced in tempting others to sin with him. His mum had prayed for him to become a great preacher, and he was the very opposite. A preacher is somebody who points people to God and calls people to repentance. John was living a life that was deliberately leading people into sin and rebellion. How many of us here are praying for people? Maybe members of our own family, maybe friends, maybe colleagues, maybe neighbours, who seem to be living in deliberate rebellion against the gospel, who have utterly rejected the very teachings of our Creator. Who do we look at and we think that person is too far gone to be saved? This person has no interest in the gospel. There is no way they can ever be saved. John Newton was somebody you would have put in that category. Who do you look at now and you wonder what has gone wrong when you taught them so well as children, but now have rejected everything? Let me encourage you to keep praying for them. Like John's mum prayed for him, keep praying for them. And remember, it was the prayers that he had heard before he was even 7 years old that came back to him on the ship that night. If you have any influence with any young people, keep showing them the example of faith and prayer. Keep showing them. When he faced death that night, he remembered those prayers. When that person that you prayed with as a young child, one day, those prayers will come back to them. One day, those little Bible lessons that you've sat and read with them on your knee, one day they will come back to them. Those children that we have come here on a Friday and we teach them and we teach them and we teach them. I don't know if they're going to instantly fall down now and give their lives to God, or whether they're going to rebel and walk away for decades. One day, those lessons that we've taught them will come back when they need it. God saved John Newton. His salvation was 100% a gift of God's undeserved, amazing grace. But he knew how to call because of the lessons he'd learned from his mum. Let's give people the tools that they need to be able to call for salvation. And then pray. And pray and pray that God will bring them to the point where they use those tools and cry out for the salvation that they need. But there's a little lesson here for us as a church as well, because John Newton did not instantly become a model Christian. When people come to faith, we need to give them some grace of our own as well. They're not going to change. John Newton backslid. He kept on sinning. The church didn't reject him. They supported him. They encouraged him. They taught him. Gradually he changed to become the man who was so influential in stopping the slave trade and wrote possibly the best known hymn in the world. Let's be willing to show grace, encouragement, help and support to those new Christians, or even mature Christians who are struggling with sin, struggling with temptation, falling back into errors that we thought they should have left so many years ago. And maybe you're struggling with sin. Maybe there's temptations that you feel are just too big, so much ingrained in you, so written into your life that they're virtually impossible to change. Well, on your own, do you know what? Yes, they are impossible to change, but not with God. God changed the heart of John Newton. And he can change our hearts. Let's take those sins to him now. Let's take those sins. God, will you help me with that? Change my heart. Stop me wanting to do that. Help me to show that grace that you've shown to others. Help me to show that love. Help me to stop judging, to stop getting angry, whatever it is. Trust God. Trust that those sins are paid for as well. If your faith is in Jesus Christ, those sins have been paid for. God isn't going to punish you for them. He will help you to change, and that might be painful, but he's not going to punish you. It's paid for by Jesus Christ already. Verse 25, God presented him, that is Jesus, as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. There is nothing left for you to pay. But just as God used John Newton, a dedicated sinner, to show others the power of his salvation, well, so he can use us to show people the power of his salvation, the way that he can change us. Leave the final words of this sermon to John Newton. This is faith. A renouncing of everything we are apt to call our own, and relying wholly upon the blood, righteousness, and intercession of Jesus.